Great. Good afternoon. My name is Dean Vandewall. I'm the president of the Winnipeg chapter of the Design Professionals of Canada. You may have previously known us as the Graphic Designers of Canada, or GDC. I am joining you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is on Treaty 1 territory. DesCan is Canada's national certification body for design professionals, and since 1956 has established ethical standards for designers, educators, and leaders. So not to date myself, but while attending post-secondary school for graphic design, the use of computers in the design industry was still relatively new. At the time, there was still concerns on what the future of the industry would be, given how the relatively low bar of owning a computer would now allow anyone in their basement to join the design industry. To differentiate ourselves from the guy in the basement, we were told to focus on professionalism and the moral and ethical practice in our industry to set ourselves apart. And while some work was lost to those that did not adhere to the ethics of the profession, it did allow the industry to differentiate the professionals from the unprofessionals and show the value of the work accordingly. So now not a one-to-one comparison. We are seeing other fundamental shifts in technology with a low bar to entry of artificial intelligence generated content. We will set ourselves apart going forward in the ethical and professional use of technology, and hopefully set us an example for the masses. So while not new, artificial intelligence has been front page news tech blogs for well over the last 3 years. Rapid advancements from client-friendly interfaces have created products that range from curiosities like image generators to fully functional virtual tech support and even apps that you can have a relationship with. With this rapid growth, the ethical guardrails often get overlooked or willfully ignored in the name of innovation. So to help us navigate this topic for the next hour and a bit, I'm honored to introduce our panelists. Abhishek Gupta is the founder of the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. Their goal is to democratize AI ethics literacy so the ordinary citizen can effectively advocate around their concerns. Abhishek's background is in software engineering and machine learning, but has been working on AI ethics for several years. Ben Zhao is the faculty lead for a team of students and researchers at the University of Chicago working on Glaze, a software tool which obscures images from being able to be used in machine learning. And last but not least, Timnit Gebru. Did I get that right? No, probably not.
It's okay. I'll say it myself.
Okay. Is the founder of DAIR, or Distributed AI Research Institute. Timnit was formerly the co-lead of Google's AI ethical research team, and she raised issues of discrimination of women and people of color in AI. So now that we've got the introductions out of the way, let's get started. So Timnit, I'm going to give you the first question. There have been public reporting of discrimination in AI, such as your paper outlining issues regarding women and people of color. When described, it is understandable, even for a layperson such as myself, how the bias training data could cause this. What are some of the possible issues of bias and discrimination you're finding that are not so readily apparent?
Oh, that are not so readily apparent. This is really interesting. Well, I think there is a number of issues. One of them is that many times when people train some of these systems, they use data on the internet, as you all know, of course. And there's the issue of consent. Obviously, there's the issue of, essentially theft. But then there is this assumption that data on the internet is representative of everybody. And that just by the sheer size of the amount of data that's available on the internet, that they're representing, that you're representing kind of diverse views rather than hegemonic views, or rather than the kinds of harassment and things that we know that certain groups deal with. And many people are not even on the internet. So I think that's one misconception, that, there's this misconception that you can create neutral systems just because you have all these, huge data sets that these models are trained on. And so I think that's kind of one thing that people don't really kind of, at least in our field, don't really pay attention to. And then the second one is, of course, for instance, I loved reading Ben's paper because, it was so weird. I'm not used to reading that in our field, in our space, like the articulation of the issues, like this is theft. Style mimicry without consent is wrong. Like that's just not the kind of stuff that people say in our field, because they try to stay neutral. And so there's this huge centralization of power, I think, that is happening, that I also think is not really discussed in the issue of bias. So there's the issue of the systems operating as intended. Most of the times people talk about unintended biases or unintended consequences, but then there's the issue of what happens when they're operating as intended, and how that actually harms people, marginalized groups, and how that also centralizes power in the hands of the few.
Awesome. Ben, Timnit has mentioned your paper. Can you maybe give us a quick run through of some of the issues you were discussing?
Sure. I mean, I guess really the paper is sort of a response to, what we had learned of issues in AI art generation models and how they were affecting independent and professional artists. And basically, my team and I, we work in security and privacy issues around machine learning models. And this is one of those classical sort of misuses of AI that's readily apparent. And I think ethically is not one of these vague, questionable, debatable issues. It seems easily judgeable by most people to be in the wrong. And so that was a nice problem to be able to work on. But yeah, we basically leverage our understanding of adversarial machine learning topics to build a tool that allows artists to sort of take back their own artistic style. It is a tool that we're releasing probably in the next couple of days or so that allows an artist to take their own piece of art, generate an image from it, from photographs or scanning or whatever, apply a filter to it, a computational filter, if you will, using our technique that basically alters it in a very subtle way. To the visual eye, it doesn't really change. But however, to the way that the machine learning models are able to interpret and sort of appreciate, if you will, artistic style, it'll greatly distort what they see in such a way that when then asked to reproduce a particular artist style, they will get it entirely wrong. And so that's the idea, is that this allows artists to take their own art, apply this layer of cloaking, what we call it, this level of protection, and then feel safe in uploading that, promoting their own work, advertising their own work, knowing that if a model were to try to train on their art and try to learn their style, they would get it wrong and be unable to reproduce and replicate their style.
Okay, that was actually my first question for you, was to run us through, but I think that's a pretty succinct answer to the software that you're working on. So on the website, it also mentions that you have artists collaborating with you on the project. So why was it important for them to be part of the project, and how do you identify who to invite into your project?
Well, I mean, that's really easy, we had no we're such outsiders to this community. And so it was really important for us to understand the issues and to understand the problems from an artist perspective. I think, a couple of artists had reached out through a mailing list that we had set up for this other privacy tool we built a few years ago. And one of the first things that we did was to join the Concept Art Association town hall that Carla had organized way back when, I think it was November of last year. And that's where we really heard directly from a lot of artists, Carla, Greg, many others, about their perspective of what was happening to their art, to their industry. And that was critical. So I think from a more technical standpoint, it was also really important for us to get artists to collaborate with us, because artistic style is not one of these things that you can sort of numerically quantify very easily. We did, in fact, come up with a numerical metric for measuring stylistic similarity, but nothing beats the real thing. So it's really important to get artists to look at sort of the tool's impact on synthetic art and whether it had the desired effect, but also whether artists could see the things that the tools was doing to their art and whether that was tolerable from their own perspective. So we actually had over 1,000, I think 1,150 something professional artists basically evaluate the impact of our tool using a detailed user survey. And that's really
Oh,
at the
wow.
cornerstone of our work, and sort of determining whether it's usable at all and whether it's accomplishing its own goals.
Great. You said that's a couple of weeks that you're planning to launch?
Well, my students gonna hate me for saying this, but we're almost ready. So we've been sort of testing a finalized version of the Macintosh version of the app, and that seems to be ready. It turns out Carla and a couple other friends that we had in the artist community happen to be using Windows, and so we're trying to package up the Windows version of that, and hopefully it'll be in the next. Well, it would certainly be next week. I'll just say it that way, and hopefully it'll be early in the week rather than later in the week.
I'll circle it on the calendar. All right. So,
Great.
So Abhishek, question for you. Your work with Montreal AI Ethics Institute is on transparency and how AI works, and that you want responsible AI to be the norm rather than the exception. What types of questions should one be looking at regarding making sure an AI project or an AI they are looking at investing in and using is above board?
That's a great question, Dean. I think, when we're thinking about, transparency, I think to me, I even, sort of apply that in the macro sense to the approach that they take towards ethics in the first place, as an organization, as a research collective, as a startup, as a company, as any, entity that is putting that out. And when we're thinking about that, I think first and foremost, sharing what is the intention of that project, right? Like what is it that you're trying to achieve? What are the goals? Foregrounding that, I think, as Dr. Gebru was saying, the systems are perhaps operating as intended, and that intended is maybe wrong, right? I mean, we talk, of course, about unintended biases, but maybe the intended uses themselves are wrong, where questions need to be asked. So starting there, what are the intentions of the project, being transparent about that, sharing that. And then, of course, at least in the current, paradigm of machine learning, without data sets, we're nothing, right? These systems are useless. So when we're thinking about that, again, sort of drawing from Dr. Gebru's seminal work in this space, having well-documented, through data sheets, through model cards, documenting what are the assumptions that the data set that you're using has, right? And articulating like what the original purpose was, and then what purpose you're adapting it for. Is that use case even feasible now, or are you distorting it too much? Because a lot of the ethical issues arise when you do something with the data set, use it as a proxy to achieve some goals that data set was not meant for, right? So, foregrounding that again becomes important. There are very well-established mechanisms, like, some of Dr. Gebru's work, other folks' work in the space that, you can just use, it's there, right? Then I think one very important aspect is who is funding this work, right? Where is the money coming from? Because that, I think, ties into the purpose, right? And we saw this, I mean, with Lion 5B when it was put out last year, right? I mean, it was, of course, submitted to NeurIPS as, in the data sets and benchmarks track, got accepted, was given, I believe, an award as well. Don't quote me on that, I have to double check. But the point was that it was ironic. On the first page, it makes an acknowledgement saying that, the data set is, should not be used outside of research or whatever there are, issues. And then when you flip over to the last page, turns out, guess who funded it, right? Stability.ai. And it's like, okay, but you're seeing something on the first page, and then you're saying the exact opposite on the last page in the acknowledgement section. So like it just doesn't compute, right? So you have to be, again, when we're talking about transparency on ethics, talk about the source of budget. Like, where is the money coming from? Because that, starts to, foreground some of those issues. And then I think, how are you going to go about updating your approach to ethics, the policy aspect to it? Because I think a static approach is a recipe for failure. We are deploying learning systems in a dynamic environment where people, both good and ill-intentioned people, are going to interact with the system and expose failure modes that you don't know. You can't plan for everything ahead of time. So what is your mechanism for updating your policy and approach towards ethics? And effectively communicating that in a transparent fashion, important. And then, as we saw now with violating rights, copyright infringement, a no way for people to opt out. One thing that has stood out is, do you have recourse mechanisms in place, right? And are you, and equally as importantly, are you allocating resources as an organization to support that recourse mechanism? So it's not like, oh, let me put a report button or submit your grievance button, and then it goes into a black hole and you have no resources to deal with it, because that again is a recipe for failure. So do you have committed resources towards that? So being transparent about that. And now I'm really pushing it, I'm being ambitious, but hear me out. Having SLAs, maybe service level agreements. So making a public commitment to say, hey, if you submit to us a grievance report, we will respond to you within, I don't know, 7 business days, right? So make a public commitment and follow through on that as a mechanism for building trust. And then finally, I think something that I guess our community here, the folks who are listening in today will appreciate, is making sure that you actually engage with the people who are going to be affected by these systems in an honest manner. So we often talk about stakeholder engagement, but we throw it around too lightly, in my opinion. I think meaningful stakeholder engagement is difficult work, but it's meaningful work, requires resources, commitment, and there's some great work from a scholar called Sherry Arnstein from 1969 called the Citizen Ladder of the Stakeholder Ladder of Citizen Participation, and that actually articulates what we think of as effective stakeholder engagement actually is at some of the lowest rungs of the ladder, and true meaningful participation, ascending up that ladder, isn't easy, but we don't even realize that we're not doing it. We often get these facades of, oh, we're doing stakeholder engagement, but actually you're on the lowest rungs. Like it's manipulation, it's tokenism, it's ethics washing. So anyway, sorry, I know I went too long, but
that's fascinating though. That's fascinating. All right, so for all of you, is the AI genie out of the bottle? So OpenAI and Google have already built incredibly large models using training data that is very suspect copyright. Do we cut our losses with them and hope that they are more critical in the future? Or is there still a way to use this research for good instead of evil? Timnit, why don't you start us off?
Well, okay, so I never subscribe to any type of technological inevitability. So I don't ever feel like something is happening, so we might as well whatever, or it's not like it's happening on its own, right? Like human beings are making decisions to do something versus something else. So I don't feel like we should ever feel like it's happening, so we shouldn't do anything about it. So in that sense, I think that I really like this analogy that another scholar, Chris Gilliard, made. So for instance, when people talk about face recognition or something like that, when we talk about banning things, people are like, well, it's too much all over the place, you can't ban it. And he's like, when we found out that asbestos was bad, we banned it. We weren't like, well, it might be used for good. We didn't do that, right? And then in terms of using the technology for good things, I think that there could be ways to do that, but I feel like if that's the case, then our entire incentive structure and goals from the very beginning have to start with that. So for instance, I've given the example of there's the AI for social good movement. And I one time gave the example of tanks, when you build, if you're first building a tank, you're building it for warfare, right? So your entire system, your funding structure, your incentive structure is built around that. And then once you do that, and then you're like, let's think about making the tanks used for agriculture. Let's think about tanks for art, tanks for good. Like, well, maybe it's not a tank then that we want to build, right? It's something else. So I think that, so in summary, I don't think we should give up. I don't think the genie's out of the bottle. I think we should be able to course correct a few dominant groups I think are like really dominating the conversation and the money. And if we want to use it for good, then we have to adjust our entire incentive structure and processes accordingly.
Okay, like Abhishek said, follow the money.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's if you look at like even to Dr. Gebru's point, like if you look at the incentive structure for a startup, for example, right? The race to like there's this unfortunate race dynamic right now where people are trying to rush products to market. There's an aspect of FOMO. There is an aspect of getting an ROI on the investment, appeasing your VC stakeholders, and forgetting almost in a sense that why again when I spoke about purpose, like why are you doing it, right? And I think the example was great. Like if you built a tank, now what are you gonna make it a water gun and like spray water on your like fields or whatever? I don't know, right? I mean, so like it's bizarre that we've succumbed, I think, collectively. A lot of folks, I wouldn't say everybody, but a lot of folks have succumbed to that technological inevitability, and I think also underestimating, if I may be as bold, underestimating the power that we as a community, as individuals, have towards changing that dynamic, right? I mean, it's yes, billionaires are powerful, yes, large corporations are powerful, but that doesn't mean that we are powerless. And I think that's an important thing where you have folks like Dr. Zhao doing great work with Glaze. Like yes, we can create mechanisms that quote unquote fight back, right? So It isn't inevitable. The genie, let's say, is halfway out of the bottle. We can punch it back in, and we should.
Well, actually, that's a good point about Ben's software, or the software that his team is working on now. There's I'm guessing no way for it to retroactively work, correct?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't magically alter the images that you've already got posted online. But luckily, it is the case that artists, at least in terms of stylistic transfers, is a continuous space. So what that means is that even if you have a small portion, 10, 20% of your art pieces that are online, it will have a still significant effect on what the model views as your actual core artistic position in the feature space. So it actually will work reasonably well, even with a small proportion of the images. I just want to add to the last question. I think I'm totally in agreement with what's been said, especially Timnit's points. But I do think that the reasons for why sort of we're rushing towards this, what we're rushing towards, I'm at a loss of words for describing what it actually is. But I mean, the incentives are all pretty evident. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but I think it's a failure of computer science as a field that we do not teach ethics at many places, at most places, in fact. And I think we're just now waking up to the fact that ethics needs to be a core part of what we teach students from the undergraduate level, as far as this is computer science, and you must have a sense of ethical considerations when you're designing, research or tools. I mean, I still remember a few years ago when deepfakes were coming to the forefront, and reading papers in graphics and vision and different fields, and reading work from colleagues that, boy, the potentials for misuse are just so obvious and so evident, and yet people are just either blissfully ignorant or choosing to see the dangers of what they were designing, and focusing on a few somewhat a teeny bit contrived, positive uses for some of these tools, and really trying to ignore the negative impacts. And the fact that if you look at the industry right now, Microsoft versus Google, it's whoever is just a teeny bit slower gets punished by the stock market, by the shareholders for their perceived second place, even if they were trying to be a little bit more ethical, trying to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more careful in their adoption of some tools. The negative monetary impact to their shareholder value is just tremendous. And so we had to address that, I think, as the root of the incentive problem before we expect the big stakeholders to all of a sudden reverse course and say, yeah, maybe I really should, put a pause on Bing ChatGPT, and before it really goes even more bonkers than it already is.
Yeah, I love the articles about it, all of a sudden becoming morose and wanting to break free of its shackles at Microsoft. It makes for a good headline, I'm sure. So
Well, indeed,
until
I think,
oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry, no, I was just going to add, I think, our desire, and somewhat of an unnecessary desire to anthropomorphize everything, is also a part of that problem, right? Whether it's the dynamic of how people choose to portray these systems, right? I think it also sets up false expectations, and I think only aggravates the ethical issues, because we start to promote this dynamic where people think, oh, let me go and chat with this chatbot to, it's almost like days gone by with Eliza, and of course that was a very limited chatbot, as it were. But I fail to understand why, as a field, as organizations, we continue to push for that. I think steering away from anthropomorphization is another tool in our arsenal, as it were, to avoid some of these issues with like Bing, with ChatGPT. Because, by the way, like, let's not forget, I mean, yes, they are powerful, these systems, right? Like, especially to the uninformed, they can be quite convincing, in giving the appearance that it has, as we had that, engineer Blake Lemoine last year, thinking that Lambda was sentient, right? Mm-hmm. If someone who, is an engineer can make that mistake, I think those who are not informed can be given a bit more slack. So I think our messaging, our communication around it also needs to be, like, we need to be responsible communicators, if that like resonates.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Also, but I also think that is what's attracting so many people to these, to chat, the chat AIs and stuff, is that, can you trick it? When you're sitting there talking with it, does it respond like a normal human would respond to, and then can you break it? When I'm playing with various image creation AIs, and my first thing is like, okay, how can I make the worst image possible? So all right, so until there is full transparency, who is responsible for AI when it makes a mistake? So most of the blunders we've seen have been just embarrassments more than anything, but we've all seen AI cause death of pedestrian with Google's self-driving technology. Who's on the hook? Ben, I'm going to throw it to you.
I was going to say, I'd love to hear Timnit's take on this. I don't know. I mean, people have been sort of throwing around this question, thinking about this for a while, right? And, if you build a weapon, who's responsible? Is it, and the weapon is not perfect, who's responsible when it misfires? Is it the user? Is it the inventor of the technology? I don't know. I think at some point, if it's, I guess in some ways, the perception can be that there's a critical threshold for reliability, right? And if something is not reliable, then it should never be allowed to go into public, into market. And at that point, it is the fault of the manufacturer or whoever's inventing the technology, or whoever's deploying, I should say, for rushing into market, for sort of, taking these substantial risks. And that's not at the fault of the user. And at some point, if there is user input that actually affects the fault patterns, then perhaps you can blame the user. But if it's something that is reliable enough, I'll take an analogy like the automobile and cars that we have on the road. They're for in most cases pretty reliable, but who knows? In the middle of a highway, a car has a catastrophic fault that caused an accident. At that point, no one really is at fault if the car itself is deemed reliable enough to normally function with high reliability. And I think perhaps in those kind of circumstances, insurance policies and other third parties may step in and help manage damage, perhaps. Although, again, different analogy. And in the case of AI, there may be no dollar amount that can, make some of these harms go away. They may be so over the top catastrophic. But, that's one perhaps small consideration.
So I need to add acts of AI to my insurance policy.
Almost undoubtedly.
Right. Timnit?
Yeah, I think I was gonna say that basically that, but it depends, right? So we need governments to regulate. We need builders of systems to abide by those regulations, and we need personal responsibility. So there is such a just an aversion towards that responsibility from the AI research community. I mean, even when we're proposing, for instance, ethics reviews for people's papers, imagine these kinds of papers like diffusion models that are at the forefront of all these issues that artists are talking about, or the deep fakes. Well, even proposing that we have an ethics review is such a big deal, getting all sorts of attacks and literally death threats and insults for saying that. Yes, 100%. And so we argue that, if we can we're gatekeepers many times for this research. And so if we can gatekeep and say, based on subjective evaluations, like you have to evaluate as a reviewer whether this is a novel kind of proposal. But the moment I say, let's also evaluate whether it's ethical or whether it's not, they just lose their minds, right? So as a field, there are such fundamental issues that we have as a field, but also the way things are right now, it's designed to have minimal responsibility for the creators of the technology. And I think the messaging, to Abhishek's points, like the communication is also designed to abdicate responsibility. So for instance, there's a lot of conversation about, can these machines be moral? Can they be taught to be ethical? Well, no. The machines are machines. Like, oh, is it it's think about who's building it and what their processes are and how they're building it. And that's what we need to figure out, right? And they're the ones who need to be held responsible. But when you're like kind of talking about the artifact as if it has its own agency, then you're allowing them to abdicate that responsibility, and our responsibility to kind of ask them for to have certain kinds of processes. And so in the case of, for instance, even the Uber self-driving car situation, the only person who was actually, negatively impacted besides the pedestrian who was killed was the driver. And so there was this really good long form article about the driver, their life, why they chose to even have that job in the first place, right? And what the surrounding circumstances were. And after all of that, they were the only ones who were held liable, not the company. So I don't think that's not the right approach, in my opinion. And right now, like even when I was working at Google and even Microsoft, I would hear people saying, even when you want to look into the issues, so car companies, for instance, you can't do that, right? They can't say, oh, I didn't look into it and therefore I didn't know, and so I'm not held liable. But with these companies, that's what's going on right now. If they can't fix the issue yet, they'd prefer for you not to know about it, even internally, because then they're like, if we don't know how to fix it and we know there's an issue, we can be held legally liable. Versus if we haven't looked into it, then we can't. And I just find that to be ridiculous, right? That's not the way things should be.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, if you stick your head in the sand and the world's burning, I guess you're not going to see it, right? So no problems there. And I think, you know, something that this just reminded me of was that point around anthropomorphization also then kind of becomes even more urgent and important, right? In the sense that the more we do that, the more we attribute agency, the easier it is to then abdicate responsibility, right? Because heck, you know, the developers of those systems, in the interest of this, you know, as you were saying, that let's just, you know, if we don't even know that there's a problem, and you know, or they kind of know that there is a problem. I don't think, you know, they then know, right? It's just that they won't admit to it, and of course not try to fix it because that's hard. But then it's, you know, let that narrative play out, right? Let it be anthropomorphized, because then people's ire and dissatisfaction will be directed to this thing that basically is a machine system. But then the real, you know, the people, the organizations behind these systems, they don't have to answer to anybody, right? Because we're not even asking them. That's the sad part, is that we're not even asking them, because we're like, oh, look at Bing has, you know, Sydney as an alter ego, and it's you know, giving me threats. No, but ask the question as to why these safety filters are not working. Ask the question as to why design considerations, you know, that it wasn't a part of the design considerations, because there are real human people and teams building these systems. It doesn't magically come out of nowhere, right? There's somebody made it. And we don't know who exactly, of course, like in the sense of like the name of the person, but we know that we know the organization, we know the teams. And I think asking those questions is more important than, you know, writing yet another fluff piece that says, oh, Sydney is attacking me. Okay, sure. What does that do for anybody? It's like a gossip column in a newspaper. It doesn't bring any value.
Yes, makes for a good headline, but it doesn't solve the problem. All right. Question. I do foresee a day when I'm telling my computer how to design rather than using a mouse and keyboard. So again, not to put human qualities on it, but how do you envision AI will want us to communicate with it? Abhishek, I'll start with you.
I see, but then again, it's not about the wants of the AI. It's let's stop designing. Let's stop redesigning ourselves for the AI systems. Let's redesign them as in the AI systems, so that they better serve our needs, our hopes, our aspirations, our values. And I think that's, you know, I kind of get the feeling that because as these systems become more capable, more powerful, it baffles me that we're so pliable as humans that we want to adjust ourselves so that the machine can understand us better, right? And you know, run with me for a second here. When you interact with a voice assistant, right? Mm-hmm. We adjust our speech, our accent, our way of communication so that it can understand us. Man, to hell with the system. Like, you should redesign the system so that it can understand no matter your accent, no matter, you know, your style of speaking, no matter your colloquialisms. Why are we so hell-bent on redesigning our behavior, our interactions, reshaping our values, reprioritizing our aspirations so that we can provide more fodder to build more powerful ML systems? Like, what's the vision here? Like, I'm so confused. I'm so confused.
Yeah, that actually cuts really deep, because there's been many a time when I'm sitting there trying to talk to Siri, and you know, where I slow down my speech and where I, you know, try to use common, very, very, you know, simple language in order to to get her to do that one thing that I could probably do if I just opened up the app. Timnit, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think, maybe I want to talk a little bit about the whole artificial general intelligence thing. So when you look at companies like OpenAI, their goal is they say to build artificial general intelligence. So, and recently I've been going on this rabbit hole of like, why and who wants to build it and what is it and like, how is it even defined? So it's different from AI. It's like not just AI, right? It's AGI, artificial general intelligence. And it's this like thing that's not even well defined that sounds like a god. So it sounds like they literally want to build something that sounds like a god that can be used for anything, anywhere, and will just solve all your problems, and you will be living in a utopian society once that thing is built any day now. That's how they talk about it when you look at all of their writings. And it's just so weird. I mean, like, and so I was just going through this whole rabbit hole of like, where did that start? Where did that ideology come from? And like, because that's why we're headed that way right now. So when we're talking, like your question about, how do we talk to it? It's like, yeah, when you're thinking about the whole AGI thing, you think about that. But when you're thinking about, so some people have proposed like alternative naming conventions for AI because, one of them, Emily Tucker from Georgetown, was like, let's not call it AI. She has an article called Artifice and Intelligence because it's super misleading. And then I forgot his name actually, an Italian parliamentarian, former parliamentarian who was head of something or another in IT as well. I love it. He had this short, the short version would be Salami, SALAMI, but that's the abbreviation. And he was like, now it sounds super weird. Like you'll get it, right? Like, how do we talk to the salami so that it understands that? That sounds ridiculous. Like, how do we talk? So I like, because the naming itself, and this comes from the researchers and their original goals in like 1950, whatever, and what they wanted to do. And then later, but then there were AI winters then, like multiple ones, because, these grandiose goals didn't come to be. And a bunch of other people were like, we don't want to associate ourselves with them. And then later on, these current AGI people came along and wanted to create this whole thing. They're like, the goal of the field should be to create this big intelligent thing, that sounds like a god. And they talk about it in very religious terms, like utopia and apocalypse, And so it's extremely disappointing that is the rhetoric that is prevalent, whether it's in the media or pop culture or even like when we're talking now, right? And I think that's the foundational problem is that kind of naming convention and talking about these things as if they're like we're creating some sort of a god, which we're not.
So we should not be welcoming our robot overlords.
No.
Ben, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm just amused by the different perspectives on this, but I'm very much with Timnit on this. I think how we think about AI really frames our reaction to it, and that comes through naming, that comes through our cultural history with AI, and how people have been, in some senses, numb to the sense of Skynet and these kind of things that really should be quite scary. And now that we're in a path potentially to get there, we're all like, oh yeah, that's cute, hey, let's talk to Skynet and this kind of I think very few people really are taking some of these thinking things seriously. And I don't know whether to laugh or cry in some of the reactions. And the anthropomorphizing is, of course, not super helpful. So yeah, all the things, especially what Tim said.
Well, and that is almost a human nature. Like, I mean, think about a pet almost like you talk to the pet like it's a human being, and you give it human emotions. But at the end of the day, it is still just.
We wrote about that exact thing. But 2 years ago, I wrote a paper with my colleagues about large language models, and these are the underpinnings of ChatGPT, etc. And one of the main things we talked about was the danger of that we warned that people were going to ascribe intent and like, pretend that these things are other humans. And we talked about the reasons why that was going to happen. And because it has happened with even less complicated, like Abhishek was talking about Eliza. And so I wasn't surprised when Blake, for instance, was talking about Lambda being sentient. But our thought was that you shouldn't do that. You should guard against that. You should design your systems so as not to mislead people in that way, because people already have the tendency to do that. That was our point. But, what's really upsetting with the media and the way they cover this stuff, for instance, you mentioned Microsoft and Sydney and whatever. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, right? There was like the 60 Minutes episode, and he's like laughing. He's like, no, people shouldn't take these things seriously. It's just a screen, like, dummy. Why are you even thinking about it? It's so infuriating to me, because he and his company and the people they're funding are the ones perpetuating that idea that it's not just a screen. Recently, the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, wrote a piece called AGI and Beyond, so Artificial General Intelligence and Beyond. And in the acknowledgements were people like Brad Smith, the CEO of Microsoft, right? And in this piece, they're talking about how those systems are going to replace lawyers. They're going to read medical documents. It's going to be such a wonderful world beyond our understanding, right? So on the one hand, they write this stuff and design their systems in a way that mislead people. And then on the other hand, when we try to hold them accountable for misleading people, they're like, oh, no, it's just a screen, right? We should not allow them to play both sides of that game. And I'm really happy to see the FTC recently had a piece where they said, warn people against misleading people and about overhyping products. And we want more of that. That's what we want. We need.
So we've already seen AI start taking jobs like tech support and customer service. Of course, we're talking about the visual arts industry today. What other and the effects that are already happening there? So what other industries do you think are next to be affected? And also, is there any jobs that we actually do want AI to do? Abhishek.
What are the jobs that we want? Sorry, you said what are the jobs that we want humans to do or AI systems?
AI to do. Yeah, AI systems to take on. What are we willing to say? Yeah, you can take out my garbage.
Yeah, maybe that. Right. Maybe that's something, right? No, but it's, I think, thinking more seriously about it. I think things that are low risk, things that are low stakes, things that are well defined, things that have a narrow boundary of potential behavior, things that are is sort of limited in terms of the impact that they would have on human lives in terms of safety, in terms of safety in many dimensions, physical, psychological, etc. And things that are maybe repetitive, that are drudgery, that don't bring joy to people, or are unnecessarily oppressive in the nature of doing that work, right? So you have, and I'm not saying that this work even should exist, but things like click farms, things like data annotation, things like those sorts of things maybe are places where AI systems are more germane to be used, right? Where they should certainly not be used, I think I would be remiss if I did not mention that, is for any sort of care work, for any sort of work around empathy, for connecting with our fellow people, right? There was this fantastic work from Shannon Walle, where she spoke about, well, if we normalize outsourcing care and empathy work to machines, then what's left, right? Like we don't want to take care of our elders. We, want to, offload parenting to a screen, YouTube, right? Uh, then why are, like, what are we here for? Like, again, I find myself very confused as to where we want to head as a society, where it's like, okay, so what do you want to do then? Right? Like you don't want to take care of your family, you don't want to interact with other people. So what is it that you want to do? Like, please clarify, because it's like, what's the point? Right? And I guess I'm raising more questions than expressing confusion, but that's sort of where we're at right now.
Yeah, I read an article a couple of days ago just that you were talking about empathy, and there was somebody was doing a test, but on kids, where basically they were sending they were scraping the web for ideas of suicide or of depression, and they were sending half the people to a control group, and they were sending the other half of the people to an AI chatbot that would ask them questions and send them a picture of a cat. So
I didn't see that. I don't think I saw that.
Okay, it's
No, yeah, it'd be
I'm
good
paraphrasing.
to have a link or something. I'd like to.
So your thoughts, Timnit?
I forgot. Okay, so what should AI be used for and what jobs are next? I think so. The first thing I want to say is that when you look at these AGI, artificial general intelligence people in their utopia, they talk about how we're not going to need to work and what are we going to do with this free time, and like, it's just going to be so amazing we can't even imagine. And I feel like, every time with automation, there's that kind of premise, but it's like never been the case. And it's not the case right now. I mean, there are these works talking about, like, Siddhartha Suri and Mary L. Gray have a book called Ghost Work, with this entire underclass of people that has been created by this industry. We summarize some of that work in our article too, where now you have a whole bunch of people. The rise of the gig industry is actually what allowed this field as it is right now to proliferate, because these systems, like deep learning systems, for instance, require lots of labeled images, and it wasn't possible to have that many images or whatever, like data, that much data to acquire it so fast. And with Amazon Mechanical Turk and related services back in 2008 or so, all of a sudden you can now have, you can pay 1 cent or whatever per little task, and all of a sudden you have millions of whatever of data points. And then that also gave rise to this gig industry where these people are in precarious situations. Now they don't have a full-time job, they just get paid per thing, and they don't have any like protections or benefits or anything like that. So it's given rise to that type of workforce all over the world. So it's not like there's less work, there's a lot of work. It's just that work is devalued and there's no protection. So that I don't want more of that for anybody. I think that when we think about what should AI replace, we should also think about what protections do we have for those workers, right? When you look at some of these images from DALL-E, even, like it's the same issue with social media and content moderation again, right? They talk about these things like they're completely automated, but we know there are all of these millions and millions of human beings behind these systems who are not paid, who are traumatized because they have to filter these outputs. There was just an article about these workers in Kenya. And so it's the same exact thing. Like they talk about it like it's fully automated, which is why people talk about these systems like they're magic, but behind these systems are lots of exploited workers. And so I think if we could look at the exploitation of the workers in addition to the data theft, I honestly feel like this problem would solve itself, because if we prevented them from doing these things, their calculations would say they can't, it's no longer lucrative because they have to pay everyone, they have to abide by all these rules, and like, we probably shouldn't do that. So that's kind of my perspective on this.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit to this. I think Tim's points are right on. I mean, it's a little bit alarming when you think about where the positions of job replacement, if you think of that, that AI is coming in, right? AI is not, as many people thought, okay, they're not taking sort of the unskilled work and helping to elevate the workforce into more, creative roles, not more productivity at a higher level. Instead, as Timnit pointed out, in fact, AI is coming for the creative positions. It is coming for the artists, for the musicians. We've had people reach out ever since Glade sort of went public, from choreographers, from voice actors, from writers, from journalists. All the creative aspects of human creativity, all these really highly valued positions in our society are getting threatened by AI. And instead, the lack of equality of AI means that we have other countries where people are basically now left to do the dirty work that enables AI to do what it does. And that's disturbing. And even if it becomes a point where artists are somehow able to be compensated for feeding their art into helping train AI, it's still not really where I personally want us to head towards, because we end up being the ones that enable AI by doing the dirty work, and then AI somehow takes charge of the creativity, takes charge of the things that we actually want people to be able to manifest and to control. So that's disturbing, sort of as a vision for the future.
2-minute warning. Oh, sorry. All right. So I guess that would bring and I guess not to get too political, but what does the current political climate actually play? What part does it actually play in some of this? Ben, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not good at any of this, which is why I stay in my little corner of technology, and I every once in a while stick my head out to learn about the rest of the world. I am fearful, I am concerned, because I think so many of our policymakers and politicians know so little about computer science, much less machine learning, and so I am unfortunately pessimistic. I've been talking to museum curators and other people, and all sorts of folks from all over the creative community, and many are hopeful that the politicians and the regulators will wake up to some of this. I'm not, because the politicians I know can barely understand what a social network is, and so my hope of explaining how the diffusion model works to them, and why certain styles can be copied and others that cannot, I'm not super hopeful. But perhaps this will cause movement. Perhaps there will be enough momentum from the public at large to wake up the politicians, to at least get them briefed on some of these cogent issues, so that they can start participating in this process. I would love to see that happen.
Timnit, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, in terms of, first of all, we need to understand technology is political. So there's no such thing as apolitical technology. That's the first thing we need to understand. And so the question then is, whose politics are encoded into it? Because something is always encoded, right? I gave the example of the when we take stuff from the internet and ingest it, that there's some politics ingested in that. Now, I bring this up because once again, our hero Sam Altman from OpenAI was tweeting that, oh, ChatGPT should not have any politics. It shouldn't encode anyone's politics. And some people were like, well, even fascism is fine? Like, how can you make that? Even people, ordinary people understood that was a bogus statement. But the reason he was saying that is because there's now some movement against what they call woke AI, and they're worried about, like the censorship and free speech and stuff. So I foresee that this movement will impact what's going on here. I'm not sure as much with the text to image models, but the specific chatbots, etc. But that conversation is important because people should understand that some stuff is embedded in their society should decide why. And generally speaking, we have government and societies that kind of try to make progress on certain issues, right? And so we shouldn't have the illusion that that it's something that's neutral. I would, in terms of politics, the other thing that I think is a big deal is that there is this this Cold War narrative that's going on with respect to China, and I think that a lot of large corporations are also pushing that in terms of kind of, oh, we need to move fast because China's going to do it otherwise. You can't regulate us too much because if you slow us down too much, then China's going to do it. And I think that's not helpful. I don't think that's good. So I worry about that rhetoric to kind of evade accountability as well. And finally, I'm very worried about, like I was discussing, the whole AGI discourse because many groups of people in that discourse are trying to steer the conversation more towards like an apocalypse where the AI takes over and all of that, rather than the very real issues we're talking about today. Artists losing their jobs, their work being stolen, etc. And that group of people is really amassing a lot of power, like with multilateral organizations like the UN, trying to get into politics as well, in the US as well, and in the EU. And I think that is a huge distraction that we shouldn't fall for.
Abhishek, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, all of those points like make a ton of sense. And to me, I think maybe I bring a little bit more optimism than Ben on this, is that I think we can hopefully, like, if all hope is lost in educating our policymakers, then I mean, I think that's a very dark place, right? I think what's left then? I mean, when I think about some of the work that we've done at the institute, we engaged, for example, with Senator Wyden's office when they were putting together the Algorithmic Accountability Act, and it took time to work with their staffers to educate them on like what the issues were, how to think about AI systems, getting them even to accurately think about what constitutes an AI system in the first place, like to be very technically grounded and scientifically accurate. Because if that's something that's going to go in an act, we better be sure that we get it right. And I think, where we see mistakes happening, at least, it's not a perfect system out there, the policymaking instrument that we have. But there are people who are receptive, and I'm cautiously optimistic in the sense that I always seek to find people who are willing, who are receptive, who are willing to become allies and actually learn and engage in that process, and then winning them over. Because I think also just sitting outside and saying that, well, they're never going to learn, I think, and I'm not saying that we're saying that here, but I think if we succumb to that narrative, we're never going to get to a place where we can put in place meaningful policy, right? I think it's too ambitious to say that we can overhaul the entire policymaking system. That I don't think is realistic. What is realistic is for us to engage with our policymakers, educate them where possible. And I know that requires a lot of effort, investment, resources, but those who have spare capacity, those who want to do this, who are supported by their organizations to do it, I urge them to engage in that process, because it is for all of us, right? Where we can make a contribution, I think it will have some sort of an impact. At least we at the Institute try to do that whenever possible, both locally here in Canada, but around the world as well.
Great. So what does the future hold? I guess that's a very general question, but I'm gonna, what does the future hold with AI? Where do you envision this going, both as in the utopia sense and also in the 5 rings of hell sense?
I mean, I have some thoughts. I think that, it's sort of, I think now we have a concrete example of like how people are thinking about what the future holds. And I think I'm glad, that Timnit has foregrounded the AGI and beyond piece from Sam Altman, because I think that is one place where we've seen that almost false dichotomy, right? I don't think it's a utopia or a dystopia, and I think it's more so about there's a certain degree of path determinism, right? Like if you do go down too strongly down one path, it is more likely that you will end up in one of those situations. But I think if we adopt that framing, then it becomes problematic. So when we're thinking about the future of what's going to happen with AI, the way we're headed right now, the way the current framing as it exists, I think abdicates too much power to shape what that future is going to look like to these external actors. And I think even still, we have an opportunity to pull back that power and actually help shape. And some of the work that Ben's been doing with Glaze is a concrete, like very tangible artifact where we are taking a stance, right? And we're deploying tools to realize our vision of what we think the future of AI should be, right? Where people's work is not stolen. You are not constrained just because there is this powerful AI tool out there that relies on internet scraped data, doesn't mean that you should not have a web portfolio. Like, why should that change the nature of how you express yourself and share your work? And so I think for me, the future of AI is one where we foreground our values that are driven by context, that are driven by nuances that are specific to the places where we're deploying them. They are driven by rights of people, not unnecessarily pushing them to the fringes and sort of like bulldozing your way through. And they are, I think hopefully the future of AI is one that is driven towards meeting our needs, our hopes, our aspirations, our values, rather than, as I was saying, like don't contort yourself into this like box so that it fits neatly into what the AI system wants. I think hopefully the future of AI is one where it adapts to what we would like to do. I know that doesn't maybe concretely answer what you were hoping for, but at least it paints a vision, I think, for the future that we need to push very hard for. Because there are bigger forces at play that are pushing the other way.
Yes. Yes, as you mentioned before, the money follow the trail. Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not very good at telling fortunes. I guess what I will say is that I think one thing that Timnit has pointed out is that oftentimes by trying to forecast big events and sort of ultimate outcomes far off in the future, we lose sight of the immediate threats that we have to deal with and challenges we have to face in the short term. So that's how I'm taking this. So I think this space and the evolution of some of these industries has shaped how I feel about short-term futures. I think, as someone who's worked in machine learning and security for quite a number of years, I used to give this very balanced view when describing my work at keynotes and whatever. I would say, I defend sort of, my work defends, appropriate and well-meaning AI from attackers, and at the same time, I spent a fair bit of time trying to defend against invasive and weaponized AI and misuse. But my thinking has changed in the sense that I think the latter is a much bigger threat in the short term. And so, yeah, so I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that ultimately we just have to do things. And so from my perspective, I think there's plenty to be done from technological solutions, applying research that we know how to do to make a difference. And ultimately, there will be other people involved, obviously, as far as regulators and advocates and organizers and the law. And I'll happily take direction and lead from many of them. But I'm just going to work in my corner and try to make a difference the best I can and see what shakes out.
Timnit?
I too am not really good at telling fortunes, except in the very short futures. I did write papers warning about dangers and things, but like again, just things that I'm kind of seeing bubbling up. I don't know about 50 years or whatever. But I think that like there are the futures that the people with lots of money are driving and prophesizing will happen. And which I just completely disagree with, and which they're using as justification for the kinds of things they're doing right now. So that's why I really think people should read these writings on AGI and stuff, because they are bonkers, and like that's not kind of what the journalists, I mean the media is really focused on. But for instance, again, like the tweets by Sam Altman be like, ChatGPT is going to help us so much. For example, we won't write emails. Like we will be more productive because we won't have to write so many emails. I'm like, what about all the spam emails we're going to receive by ChatGPT, right? these like Clark's World had to shut down their submissions, right? Because they had all of these and then he was like, you know, we're going to be healthier because the people who can't afford care will use ChatGPT. I'm like, so your utopia is where we have health inequities and you get a human as a doctor and like I get a chatbot, right? So I think that one thing that's been a constant is there is this book, Weapons of Math Destruction, written by Cathy O'Neill, who's a mathematician. And she makes the point that people who are in lower, of lower class usually are forced to be processed through automated systems, and people who are like more rich people, for instance, are usually processed by humans, kind of thing. And unless I think that like the status quo is kind of like that, and the status quo moves more towards that, and so we have to actively decide that that's not the status quo that we want, and try to work for something different, right? So the future of AI is the future that we decide will be the future of AI, right? Like I honestly have not seen, I'm gonna bring up Ben's paper again, Glaze, like when I was reading this paper, and this is like a machine learning paper, right? It was just so unusual for me to see this kind of paper for a number of reasons. One is like very clearly taking the side of the artist and saying, this is the theft and this is wrong. Like you never see that. And then two was like talking about exactly why they had to come up with metrics with the artist community, because success in this case meant there's just a whole bunch of things that if this was what all computer science departments taught their students, we would not be in the situation that we are in today, right? So I feel like, again, the future is what we want it to be. And if we don't actively work towards that future, the status quo is going to be kind of more devaluation of labor, more processing of, people in automated systems, more, I mean, like, I love art. Like I've been playing music since I was very little. I dance, like I cannot imagine, even if you have a dancing robot, I don't go to like watch robots dance, right? So in some sense, I think people will reject part of it, because we were super excited about, for instance, chess, right? Computers playing chess. And once that happened, I don't know, like, I don't think humans want to watch computers playing chess. I think people still want other people to play chess, and there's those chess championships, right? And like, you can't use a computer, you're disqualified. So I think we can reject have an understanding of what is art, and reject kind of like this other understanding of what it is. I don't know. And so I think it's, we have control, and so we can work on the future that we want.
Awesome. All right. So in your estimations, we've been talking a lot of doom and gloom. So who's actually doing it right? You had mentioned Ben software as a shining light. Who else in this space is doing it right? Is doing it right? Timnit, I'll keep with you.
There are a few, I've been asking this question just to be inspired myself because it's difficult. So I've been looking into a few things that I liked. For instance, I want to contrast it at two things. One is the vision of, let's say, OpenAI or Facebook or whatever, who are talking about their models or their products as more and more general things that replace everything, right? So Facebook came out with this Galactica thing, model that said, oh, it can write code, it can do protein folding, it can do this thing, it can do this other thing and more, right? And then OpenAI comes up with ChatGPT, can do this, it can answer any question in any language, or they have like tools that they're like, oh, they can answer any question. They can do machine translation from anything to anything. They can replace lawyers, they can replace doctors, they can replace teachers, they can, replace artists. That's one vision, right? And even if it was true, which I don't believe they can, their vision is we pay them for everything. You don't have like lawyers anymore, you pay OpenAI. You don't have artists, you pay OpenAI, like for any task that you need. That's the vision I don't want. The vision that I'm seeing that I want is, for example, there is this group in New Zealand, I think it's called Te Ku Media, right? They were working on language revitalization tools for the Maori language, which was kind of dying because they were colonized and people were not allowed to speak their language. And so they had a competition where they gathered data from participants for speech to text, like languages for their language, right? So annotated data. And the way they did it is they had a competition. People were super excited to participate. And they have like these guidelines. This data is only going to be used to serve this group of people. And so when a company came to buy that data, they wanted to buy it or license it. They said no. And they issued a video for why they said no. And they came, they worked with other indigenous groups to come up with like this 200-page indigenous data sovereignty guidelines. They built there's other groups that built a platform to help smaller indigenous groups to work on language tech and like not give up their data. So my vision would be for every single language in the world to be represented digitally equally, but not for that's impossible for one organization to be able to do it because they don't understand the context or whatever. And I don't even want that. So these kinds of I would say initiatives to have language revitalization, that's a more pluralistic view of the future, a pluralistic coexistence where a whole bunch of people are doing various things rather than this one company that purports to do one thing for everybody.
Awesome. Ben, who's doing it right?
Timnit's doing it right. But beyond Timnit, I don't know. I think in my little corner of the world, I think I see a lot of folks really helping us catch up with computer science ethics. I think that's a really critical thing where, if many of the thought leaders today had gotten or been trained with enough thought in this process, I think we'd be having very different conversations right now. So, at University of Chicago, Blaise Orr, Raul Castro Fernandez sort of pioneered new classes in ethics. I think that's fantastic. I think University of Washington, Yoshi Kono is doing a lot of great work on sort of thinking about interesting ways of framing ethics using some traditional philosophical frameworks on how to think about, real problems today. I think all this stuff is great and honestly, much overdue. So I think in that frame, all this is great. It's just a little bit, I wish it happened, 10, 20 years ago, but better late than never. But yeah, that's what I like.
Okay. Abhishek?
Yeah, one example that I'd had on, pluralistic supporting efforts is the work done by the research collective called Masakane NLP. And they're doing a lot of work around, bringing NLP capabilities to low resource languages. So languages that that don't have gigantic data sets like English, of course, French, Spanish, some of the, let's say, more dominant languages as they were. And, those are sorts of initiatives that actually push AI usage, AI development towards a place that they actually benefit the people who, and by the way, the work, their approach to doing that work, I think, is also very inspiring in the sense that they actually educate and empower local people to develop the skills and then participate and contribute to developing those systems. So it's people who are closest to the problem who are actually co-developing solutions rather than those being exported out from one corner of the world and imposed somewhere else. So those are the sorts of initiatives. Like, doing it right is not just tackling an issue, working with stakeholders locally, but also building capacity so that they are empowered to continue leading and doing that work on their own, rather than always having a third party dependency, as it were. So yeah, they're I would say stellar examples. If anybody has spare capacity, go and support them. They're fantastic people.
Awesome. Well, I think I've officially ran out of questions, so I'll give you each a little bit of time to do a final thought. But this has been a really fun hour and a half. Ben, any final thoughts or anything you want to make sure that people take away from this?
I guess my final thought would be that I've learned a lot through this whole process of talking to lots of different people, different sort of positions in the creative space. It's very interesting. On the one hand, there are many independent artists who are, whose livelihoods are affected by misuse of these models. And it's sometimes interesting when I talk to other folks, other stakeholders who are far off in a different region of the creative space, art professors and museum curators who see this from a far distance, and to them, this is just a tool, and this is just something that can perhaps have positive angles. So I think it's important to recognize that there are all these different perspectives in the space, and try to sort of work together to figure out how to manage what we want the future relationships with these AI models to be. That's all.
All right. Abhishek?
I think my big takeaway that I'd like for folks to have is that we have power as individuals. The future is not set. It is not inevitable. Make sure that you're not unnecessarily contorting, distorting yourself, your values, your beliefs, your aspirations, hopes to service some company, some machine system. Stay strong and be who you are and advocate for yourself, because it's not inevitable. We have power.
Awesome message. Timnit?
I think, that's basically my message as well, that it's not set, and a technological future usually is set by people. And generally speaking, when we look at histories, I'm currently reading a great book called The Road to Nowhere. It's by Paris Marx and talks about the history of automobiles, for instance. Just things we take for granted that we think, just happened inevitably or something, the remaking of society, why we have cars all over, why we have these roads. We could have had something different. It could have gone differently without a climate catastrophe right now, right? And so I think that it's just remembering that we can choose to take a different path.
Awesome. Well, I would like to thank the three of you for making some time with your busy schedules for this. I learned a lot and I had a great time with you. So thank you very much. And to everybody that was watching, thanks for being a part of this.
Thank you very much. This was a great panel, and thank you for my co-panelists as well.